Good morning. Welcome to Los Angeles. If you're from out of town, we are very pleased to have you all here today. On behalf of the Asian Pacific American Legal Center, the Asian American Justice Center, the Asian Law Caucus, and the Asian American Institute, we welcome you to the very first inaugural Advancing Justice Conference. We especially welcome you because in Los Angeles, we're very pleased to host you. Next year, we'll be in Washington, D.C., and then the following year in San Francisco, and then Chicago. So we've made a major commitment of at least 4 years to all of our partners and allies throughout the country. Well, for those of you who are in the know, we were targeting 300 people for our conference, and I'm very pleased to say that over 450 of you have registered for this conference. And I'm very pleased to say there are representatives and partners from over 20 states in the United States. And just to make us feel a little more comfortable, let's welcome our friends and partners from the southern states. Please stand and let's welcome all of them. I know we have friends from Mississippi and Georgia and other southern states, Texas. Let's welcome our friends and partners from the Northeast and the East Coast. Please stand and let's welcome them. And we have a great representation from the Midwest. Could you all please stand? And those friends from California and Colorado, the whole western United States, please stand and let's thank them and welcome them. And last but not least, I said 20 states in the United States of America. We have 4 friends from Oslo, Norway. Let's please stand and let's welcome them. They told me this morning that they really liked the diversity of this conference, the speakers and the subject matter, and they came all the way from Norway. So please greet them during the day, and thank you very much for attending our conference. I do want to also thank those who have been working with the media. We have over 40 media, English, Spanish, and Asian media who will be covering different parts of our conference. So don't be shy, say whatever you want, but they'll be around the conference during the next 2 days. And I want to just have all the youth and younger folks who are 24 years and younger, please stand up and let's welcome them to this conference too. I know it's a major commitment. We were trying to get a cross-section of our community, and we realized that by focusing on nonprofits on a Thursday and Friday, we would miss some of our young folks, but we really appreciate those of you who could come and the sacrifice that you've made, and I'm sure your professors won't mind. As I said, this is the very first National Advancing Justice Conference. It's really the first national conference bringing together civil rights and social justice leaders from the Asian American and Pacific Islander communities throughout the United States. So being the first, it's exciting, but we have a lot to learn, so we will really appreciate your feedback after the 2 days to help us figure out how best to target and to elicit ideas and to continue the networking during the year. So we really would appreciate that. Now, I mentioned there's 4 convening organizations, the Legal Center, the Justice Center, the Caucus, and the Asian American Institute. Let me just have all of the staff and board members from those 4 terrific organizations please stand, and let's thank them for their hard work. You know, these types of conferences, as you know, are very logistically difficult because we have people from 20 states, Norway, coming here. So I want to give a special thanks to Clayton Young, who orchestrated all of this, and thank you, Clayton. Also, we want to thank Claire Chu in the back for her consulting work on this conference. And we'll be thanking and hearing from those who worked on the program over the next 2 days. So we appreciate all of the work. Again, our 4 organizations have been affiliated for, I was counting the years, Karen, almost 18 years. And we've done civil rights work, we've done legal service work, we've done different kinds of work throughout different parts of the United States. And we, like you, have been focusing very much on what we do, the cases, the issues, but we realized, probably about 5 or 6 years ago, that throughout the United States, there's a tremendous growth. There are 15.5 million Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders in the United States today. For those of us who are old enough, we remember in 1970, there were 1.4 million Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders in the United States of America. Think about that growth. So we realized that we have a challenge, and we have a leadership challenge to see, could we bring everybody together? And why? To learn from each other, to network, to build a new foundation for advancing justice throughout the United States. We have that responsibility collectively. And so once again, I want to thank all of you for attending this very first Advancing Justice Conference. Thank you so much. So what we're going to do today, just to give you a snapshot, we have 22 workshops, and they're really very interesting, as you could see from the speakers. We have speakers from at least, I think, 10 different Asian ethnic groups, our partners in the African American and Latino community, white community. We have 3 or 4 speakers from our younger folks, 24 and younger. We have older folks like me. We have folks from the LGBT community and straight community. We have men and women. So we really tried to bring a diversity to the speakers because those are the experts in our community. We did try to develop tracks for these 22 workshops. So the 4 tracks, as you can see from your brochure, are civil and human rights, immigrant integration and civic participation. Thirdly, community organizing and youth leadership. And fourthly, capacity building. Why capacity building? Because to sustain a movement, to sustain work of organizations, if we don't build up our capacity, we cannot sustain in a dynamic way. But building our new vision and building a stronger foundation for civil rights and social justice also requires a debate, some provocative ideas, and new trends and movements or campaigns that will really try to bring us together or at least have us think together. And so we're going to have an opening plenary on political trends in the U.S. dealing with Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. We're going to look at the comprehensive immigration reform debate and that movement to really try to address immigration challenges in 2009 and beyond. We are very fortunate that our keynote tomorrow at lunch is the United States Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights, Tom Perez. I understand that Tom is going to be making his first outside of DC public remarks to any large audience. So we're very pleased that Tom came. He's here. Karen said she actually saw him. So he's here, and we really appreciate that. And again, let us know your feedback during the day, and especially after the 2 days. We do want to make sure that this is not a one-shot deal, that this is not just a one-time in 1 year event, and that there's a continuity and networking going on between these national conferences. On a serious note, the great mayor of Los Angeles, Antonio Villaraigosa, was actually going to join me right now to welcome all of you to Los Angeles. But there was a killing at a synagogue on the west side of Los Angeles, so he's there right now with the family members. And it is totally acceptable, understandable, and that's where he needs to be with family members and the synagogue members. So we wish those families the best, and we will keep them in our minds during our deliberations. This conference of 450 people cannot happen but for key sponsorship. And I'm very appreciative of particularly the Bank of America for their premium sponsorship of this conference. It was $100,000, so it's not like a very small commitment to our community. It was a major commitment to our community. Let me thank Garrett Jin, who is Senior Vice President, Global Corporate Responsibility for Bank of America, and the Senior Marketing Manager for all of Los Angeles. Garrett, please come up and say a few words.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Los Angeles from Norway. I'll never complain about the 405 again. I am just really delighted that you could all be here to see the young people especially energized and really focused on some of the most important issues that we face as a community. So on behalf of all of us at Bank of America, we're really delighted to support this event and so many of the other important issues that the Legal Center is tackling, whether it's demographic issues or the census, preventing home foreclosures. These are some of the building blocks that really make our communities just. And Martin Luther King Jr. once said, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. And it's not without the leadership of folks like Stuart and Karen Narasaki and so many of the others who had this vision for this conference. So we're just delighted that we could be a part of it. Again, welcome to Los Angeles. You've got your care package, the flip-flops and the Carmex and everything. But most importantly, we're glad that we're all here together to listen, because great leadership obviously requires, great listening. And corporations and nonprofits here, we want to listen and learn also about what are the key issues. We want our finger on the pulse of what's going on so that we could be part of, the solution, provide meaningful answers to some of these pressing challenges that we're facing, both economically and socially. So again, we're delighted that we could be here to be a part of this and be supportive. We've got members from our Asian Leadership Network, our employee sort of Asian affinity group. We've got folks from our charitable foundation here to be a part of this as well. So again, thank you, Stuart, and have a great conference, everyone.
Thank you, Garrett. I also want to thank the State Farm Insurance Company. Leslie Mo Kaiser is a major sponsor of this conference as well. Leslie, please stand and let's thank her. There are a number of other sponsors in your booklet, so they're too numerous to thank individually, but we thank all of them. And for those of you who are amongst the 75 community co-sponsors, we really want to thank you. And for all of the community co-sponsors, could you just stand and let's thank you as a group? Please stand if you were one of the 75 community co-sponsors. Thank you. Don't be shy. We also want to acknowledge one of our community heroes. I talked about where the mayor is here, where he is right now. And 10 years ago, in August 1999, the brother of Ishmael Leto was delivering mail. He was a Filipino-American postal carrier, and a white supremacist gunned down 5 children in a Jewish community center in the North Valley of Los Angeles. They weren't killed, but they were severely injured. Then this white supremacist went outside and started hunting for other people, and the first person he targeted was Joseph Aledo, who was delivering mail, and the white supremacist asked for some help. Of course, Joseph went up, and when Joseph saw the gun, he turned and was shot 12 times in the back. Those are devastating situations, tremendous, horrific events in people's lives. But the difference is when families don't suffer in silence, but stand up for their rights, stand up for the rights of others. And I'm very proud to say the Leto family for 10 years has fought for justice, has fought for equality, has fought for peace, has fought for tolerance. And I'm very pleased to introduce Joseph's brother, Ishmael Leto, one of our community heroes. Ish. And for all of you who worked on the new hate crimes bill, I know the Leto family worked on it for 10 years. Let's all congratulate the President of the United States and the Congress for passing the new hate crimes bill. It was just signed yesterday. Our work at the Asian Pacific American Legal Center is complemented, is enhanced, is magnified by our partnership with our other affiliates, the Asian American Justice Center. I'd like to have Karen Narasaki come up, Tuet Lei from the Asian American Institute, and T.T. Liu from the Asian Law Caucus in San Francisco. And we're going to hear a few words from them, but let's all thank them for their leadership for this conference as well.
Good morning, everybody. It's like a homecoming. There's so many former staff and interns and board members here. It's really great to see you here. And I want to particularly congratulate Stuart and the Asian Pacific American Legal Center, because as most of you know, the Asian American Justice Center was his dream, and his bringing together of our organizations was really his idea, and this is a great culmination of that dream. So Stuart, really. The mission of the Asian American Justice Center is to advance and defend the civil and human rights of Asian Americans and to build an equal and more just society for all. I'd like to really welcome our community partners here from our 100+ network across the country. We know that with this economic crisis, there's a huge strain on community resources of both time and dollars. So we really appreciate your making the effort to participate in this conference. I'd like to also recognize our AAJC board chair here, Michael Beggar, who's with the firm of Bingham McCutcheon, sorry. Michael, do you want to stand? AAJC has been hosting a national conference for our community partners for over a decade, and we're pleased to have merged that conference into this national AAPI Civil Rights Conference. It's a particularly exciting time of opportunities and great challenges. Our community has already won many victories this year. The first bill President Obama signed into law was a civil rights bill, the Lilly Ledbetter Act. It was followed by the signing of the state children's health insurance program, which finally included the Immigrant Children's Health Improvement Act. Then the Filipino Veterans Bill finally became law after decades of struggle. And as Stuart just mentioned, just yesterday, I had the honor of representing the Asian American community when the president signed the Matthew Shepard and James Byrd hate crimes bill into law. Those of you who have been working with us, I want to thank you. It's been a dozen years of struggle, but for the first time, we have a civil rights law that covers the LGBT community. And of course, the law didn't stop there. It also covers gender and disability and makes it much easier for us to make sure that we can stop hate crimes against our communities. And earlier this month, the president signed an executive order renewing and strengthening the White House Initiative on Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. We still have a lot of battles, large and small ahead, like the fight for comprehensive immigration reform, the confirmation of Asian American judges, the current battle for health care reform, and the effort to make sure all of our communities are counted next April for Census 2010. We very much look forward to hearing your strategies and your ideas and working with all of you to advance justice for all of our communities. Thank you.
I'm Tuet Lay. I'm with the Asian American Institute, and we're actually the newest affiliate from Chicago. We've been a part of this great partnership for the last 4 years, and I think it's very exciting to see all the people, both from California but also outside of California. And we're really excited that everyone has been able to join us here today. I think it's particularly exciting when we talk about building foundations, which is part of the theme of this conference, and part of that is building new relationships, right? And so I really hope that people take advantage of all of the great connections that you can make at this conference. Our work in Chicago is to empower Asian Americans through advocacy, doing research, community education, and coalition building. And we join with the Legal Center, the Justice Center, and the Law Caucus in our work on immigration, on census, on redistricting. And as Stuart said, our local work is really amplified by this great partnership. The Asian American Institute has been around for 17 years, and we've been growing a lot through this partnership, and so we're really excited and can really see how capacity building in sort of smaller Asian American communities has been really important. So I really want to acknowledge all of the people who have come here from the Midwest, because lots of times people just sort of fly over us, stopping at O'Hare briefly. But we're very excited to join you all here. I also just want to acknowledge, I don't know if I see her yet, but our board president is also scheduled to be here, Diana Lynn. And so I thank her and as well as our staff for being here today. Thanks.
Good morning. It's terrific to be here. I can't think of a period in our lifetimes where there's more at stake for our communities than the period we're living through right now. Both the challenges and opportunities seem larger than life, and there's still a lot of work that we all need to do collectively to engage in a dialogue on where we are and where we need to go in order to have the most impact possible for our communities. So I thank you for taking the time out of your very busy lives and coming here from all different parts of the country, and even from Norway, I heard, to be with us. So the Asian Law Caucus is the oldest organization in the United States defending the civil and legal rights of Asians and Pacific Islanders. We have a particular emphasis on low-income and recent immigrants. I wanted today to thank our amazing board for all of their support. We have 3 board members here with us today. Professor Bill Ong-Hing, who's going to be speaking on immigration later today, so you'll have a chance to hear from him. Keith Kamasugi, who, those of you who know him, he's a communications guru and kind of a connector of people and ideas, and he will be on the strategic communications panel. And finally, I wanted to acknowledge here with us Karen Korematsu. Karen, could you please stand? So Karen is the daughter of Fred Korematsu. As many of you know, ever since the 1983 Coram Nobis case, Fred and his family have worked tirelessly to promote civil and human rights for all communities of color in the United States. And we are so grateful for their leadership. At the caucus, we're launching a new institute, the Korematsu Institute, which we expect will be a resource for social justice activists, particularly in the API community, in terms of strategic communications, community education, but also knowledge creation. So just a brief plug for the panel that I'm moderating. At 2:15, there will be a panel on, on human rights frameworks in API advocacy. And we look forward to continuing that dialogue with all of you. That will be a first convening of what we hope will be a much longer-term effort to think about how, in a strategic and impactful way, we can bring international human rights frameworks to the work that we're all doing. And there will be a report coming out of that, which we hope can be a terrific resource manual for everyone in the community. So thank you again for all of your time and energy. Are you telling me something, Clayton? No, okay. I was trying to remember if there were any housekeeping. So thank you again for all of your time and energy and for spending the next 2 days with us. Thank you.
Sorry, we have to take a photo. Thank you. I would also like to just briefly mention the Asian Pacific American Legal Center board members. 3 of our former chairs are here today. Martin Lee, Sandy Sakamoto, and Kaz Tolentino, one of our judges, and Monica Gill, one of our favorite board members. Could you all please stand and let's welcome them. As many of you know, the Asian Pacific American Legal Center, with our 60 staff and probably 500 or 600 volunteers, is proud to be the largest legal center focusing on Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. But we do legal services, we do civil rights advocacy, policy work, as well as litigation and leadership training. We're very proud to be working on a huge census project in California with at least 6 of our partners, some of whom are here, both in the Asian American, Latino, and African American communities. We're also going to be launching a major redistricting project that some of you worked with us on 10 years ago as well. But I spoke to Julie Sue, who's going to be here a little later, and we're very pleased to say that we don't want to just offer our partnership once a year at a conference. We're also looking for opportunities to connect with you during the year. And one of the new things that we'd like to announce and seek your assistance on is here at the Legal Center, we have a cutting-edge litigation team, some of them are here today. We're working with our affiliates as well, the Justice Center, the Caucus, and the Institute. And what we are trying to look for are cases with national impact, nationally impacting our community. So we'd like to provide resources and finding assistance, including our staff, to work on cases outside of California and outside of the areas in which we work. So we invite you to dialogue with us, and we invite you to partner with us on exciting and important cases during the year. Now, I want to now bring up our first plenary speakers. If they could join me up here, and I will shift gears for a moment. Once again, thank you all very much, and give yourselves a big round of applause for your coming here. As I said, we have 22 workshops, and we have 3 plenaries, a major keynote by Tom Perez. We'll have plenty of time for networking in the morning times, lunch times, as well as in our network reception, and obviously between and during plenaries. But we wanted to kick off today by having different views presented on where our community is at, especially in terms of political trends, interrelationships, intra-relationships, and have a snapshot from different experts on their view of where our community is at. I'm very pleased to introduce Karthik Ramakrishnan, who is the Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of California, Riverside. Karthik, thank you for coming. His research focuses on civic participation, immigration policy, and the politics of race, ethnicity, and immigration in the United States. Karthik is one of the principal investigators for the 2008 National Asian American Survey, and I saw Janelle Wong, a professor at USC, who also was a co-principal on that. We thank Janelle for coming. And this was the first of its kind conducted at the national level. You'll hear from myself on some of the work that Danny Chinose and Eugene Lee have done at the Legal Center, but this was really the first national survey. Karthik he received his PhD in politics from Princeton University and has held fellowships at the Public Policy Institute of California. And he is also the author of Democracy in Immigrant America, which came out in 2005. So let's welcome Karthik. Claire, I just spoke to you on the phone, so it's great to have you here. Claire Jean Kim is Associate Professor of Political Science and Asian American Studies at the University of California, Irvine. I just went out to the law school to speak 2 weeks ago. It's a brand new law school. Her work focuses on race, multiculturalism, social justice movements, and intersectionality in the U.S. She received her BA in government from Harvard College and her PhD in political science from Yale University, and has held fellowships at the Institute for Advanced Study and the University of California Humanities Research Institute. Claire is the author of Bitter Fruit, The Politics of Black Korean Conflict in New York City, that came out in 2000, which was the recipient of the American Political Science Association's Ralph Bunche Award in 2001 for the best book on cultural and ethnic pluralism. Let's welcome Claire. What I have, we do want to recognize that Karthik and Claire's work, and indeed the work at the Asian Pacific American Legal Center, is mainly focused on data on Asian Americans. We at the Legal Center recognize that, and Dan and our team are working hard to produce not only demographic profiles, but attitudinal work on Pacific Islanders, who are a great part of our diverse community throughout our country, and in particular in Southern California. I do also want to say that we're going to keep our presentations to 10 or 15 minutes each, and then we want to have at least 20 minutes for Q&A and brief comments. So you have cards at each table. So if you could write down questions during the presentations as they come to you. We'll collect them right after the presentations, and then I'll try to use them to ask the panelists questions during the 15-minute or so Q&A session. So let us begin with Karthik. We thought, while it's good to have an overview, we don't want to get people lost in a lot of data, so we're going to use some PowerPoint presentations or slides to at least show you some of the data. So once again, let's welcome Karthik.
Thank you, Stuart, and thank you all for coming out here at least on an academic standard. Seems like an early morning. As you'll see in your tables in the center, we have some handouts from the National Asian American Survey. Some of the graphs that I'll be presenting here today are outside of what you have there, and I'm happy to share with APOC or the organizers of this conference more generally the PowerPoint slides if you find it helpful. Janelle and I worked on this particular 2-page document, which took much. Sometimes when you try to say things in a very short space, it takes a lot longer than when you have a longer space to work on it. But if you have any questions, you will find our email addresses on the back, and you can write to us. And we have many more documents on the website for the survey, which is naasurvey.com. So I'm just going to briefly present some of the findings. The survey was great in a lot of ways to be working on, because we were able to, there's a lot of good work that Asian American organizations have done in terms of exit polling, but one of the challenges of just relying on exit polls is that you have a pretty suburbanized population, and it's much more difficult to get the voices of suburban Asian Americans in these exit polls. We also did our survey not just of voters, but also citizens more generally, but we also have a very large non-citizen population in our sample. And that's some of the differences that I'll be talking about today, and we analyze that in much more detail in the reports that are on the website. Next slide, please. So in terms of looking at participation, the most frequent type of statistic that people look at in terms of political participation, apart from citizenship, is to look at voting participation rates. Now, these are figures from the 2008 current population survey. And while many of us use the current population survey, I should note a caveat that the CPS is conducted only in English and Spanish. So basically, you need to have someone in the household who can fill out surveys in English to report on the behavior of everyone else in the household. So that is limited when it comes to Asian Americans, because as I'll point out shortly, in our survey, we had close to 40% of our interviews were done in an Asian American in an Asian language. So that's one potential limitation to look at, even when you're looking at the current population survey. With that caveat, if you look at this past election, it was historic in many respects. So when you look at Asian American participation, it was at the highest levels that we have seen. But when it comes to being an important share of the electorate, we found that other groups, notably Latinos and especially African Americans, their turnout increased even more. White turnout did decline in this election, so the share of the Asian American electorate actually went up slightly between 2004 and 2008. Next slide, please. Now, while it's important to look at voting, there are many other types of political participation that are important to look at. Many people in this room are not just voters, they also attend public hearings, write letters to elected officials, talk about politics with friends, neighbors, extended family members, et cetera. And we thought it was important in our study to not just measure voting, but a whole host of political activities. And what you'll find on the right-hand sidemost part of that column, and you'll see in figure 2 in your handout, is the proportion of what we call activists. Activists are people who have engaged in at least 3 or more civic and political acts in the previous year. And activists can include both citizens and non-citizens, but what we find is that the vast majority of activists are citizens. And what we find is that about 30% of the Asian American population can be labeled as activists. It's difficult to know what it should be, and that's also true when it comes to voting participation, because many of us in political science, we expect populations that have relatively high levels of education and relatively high levels of income to be participating at very high rates. And we don't find that to be the case when it comes to Asian Americans. So that's one of the puzzles that we're trying to figure out in this book project, is to how to improve participation rates among Asian Americans. I'll just say, next slide, please. I'll say a little bit about our survey. It was a survey of over 5,000 individuals. It was conducted between August and October of 2008. We have 6 primary ethnic subgroups for the Asian American population, very well represented. As Stuart noted, we tried to get other Asian groups in here, but it was very challenging to do so, mostly from a cost perspective. We tried to get a significant sample of Hmong interviews and ended up spending about a month and yielded 1 Hmong interview in our attempt to do so. But there are lessons learned from this that we hope to bring for future survey gathering efforts, and certainly when it comes to raising monies for future presidential year election surveys, we need to have a much larger scope and budget to try to get Pacific Islanders and other Asian groups into the mix. We did it in 8 interview languages, and as I indicated before, 40% of our interviews were done in an Asian language. And we actually, the way we ran the interview, we asked people if they were comfortable taking the survey in English. So this is not an overestimate of people just expressing their ethnic pride and wanting to try to take a 30-minute interview in an Asian language. If people could speak English, that was the first question that was asked. It was asked in English. So this is a pretty high proportion of respondents that took it in their native language, and I should note that it's very high, that it's quite high even among citizens. It was not just the non-citizen population that did this. And this is a national sample, and we have very large oversamples of places like California and the New York metropolitan area. We also look at new destinations, places in Texas, in the Mountain West, in the Midwest, where you have large growth in Asian American populations. And one of the things we will continue to try to do is to try to break out numbers in these new destination areas. The next set of slides, I'm going to just go briefly on some of the public opinion findings and then turn to immigration issues more specifically. So one of the issues that is very much prominent in the news today is healthcare and healthcare access for everyone. We asked a question where we tried to gauge people's level of support or opposition to the proposition that the federal government should guarantee healthcare for everyone. That's the way we worded it. And what I present here, normally you're used to seeing differences across ethnic groups. That's the way we predominantly think about Asian Americans, is thinking in terms of national origins, but we have so many different ways of cutting the data. And one of the interesting findings we have here is that we tend to think of activists as being more liberal than non-activists in the Asian American population. But what we find here is that the non-activists, and especially non-citizens, are more liberal on providing healthcare access for everyone than those who are active in politics. So it's a counterintuitive finding. The next slide, which you also have in your handouts, shows you the breakdown in terms of national origin. And even here, this defies some stereotypes that we have among ourselves. We think of Vietnamese Americans as being among the most conservative, but in fact, when we look at support for universal healthcare, it's the strongest among Vietnamese Americans. We think of Japanese Americans as being among the most liberal, and I should note that everyone supports universal healthcare. What you find is if any group is to the right, it means that they're either in favor or strongly in favor of universal healthcare. So all Asian Americans, regardless of their national origin group, are in favor, but the weakest level of support is among Japanese Americans. So again, it causes us to rethink some of our assumptions about the Asian American population. We also have some findings about abortion, and I'll just talk about this very briefly. This is where national origin potentially comes in as very important. When you look at opposition to abortion being legal in all cases, it is strongest among Filipinos and Vietnamese Americans. These are also the most Catholic populations in the Asian American community. When it comes to support for abortion access and abortion rights, the strongest levels of support are among Indian Americans and Japanese Americans. Next, we're going to look at questions of immigration policy. And one of the goals, I think, of this session is to get us to ask some questions that may be challenging. And when you think about immigration policy, it seems kind of like a no-brainer. Asian Americans are the racial group that has the highest proportion of immigrants in their population, and you would think that everyone's on the same page when it comes to immigration policy. Well, what we find in our survey is that that's not necessarily the case. So when you look at the question of professional visas and family visas, this is an issue that came up in 2006 with comprehensive immigration reform. One measure in that bill was to create something like a Canadian point system that would favor people on professional visas over people that are trying to bring family members to the United States. And you had several Asian American organizations that were resisting that because many of our communities benefit a lot from the family visa provisions that have been there for decades. What we find among the Asian American population, there are different ways that you can look at this data. First of all, you have about a third of the population that's kind of unsure about this switch from family visas towards prioritizing professional visas more. But among those who hold an opinion, almost double in favor of this switch as opposed. Now, this is a finding that's really troubling to us given where our politics are, and I'm sure where a lot of politics in the room is. And one way to think about this is to try to address that large proportion who are not sure, but also to do community education to remind people about how much communities benefit from these provisions. Many of these people who take the survey might be wildly optimistic about how they might themselves fare under this system and might discount the impact of such a policy change. But that shows you one way in which community organizations might need to focus more on trying to bring the rest of the community along on these issues. The next slide shows you similar set of results when it comes to path to citizenship. And what we find here is that in strong contrast to the Latino community, who, regardless of their national origin group, are in favor of a path to citizenship for people who are in this country illegally or with expired documents, Asian Americans at present don't seem to be too sympathetic to that. And you actually see a net opposition among Indian Americans and Japanese Americans. The only group that approaches close to 50% when it comes to support is Korean Americans. And anecdotally, at least from when it came to the immigration marches, there were a fair number of news stories about how Korean American organizations were very strong and involved in that effort. But this points to potential issues in finding common political ground when it comes to Latino interests. And that's what I'm going to end my presentation on, is a few findings when it comes to political commonality. So next slide, please. And you have this in your handout as well. We asked people how much, when it comes to issues of political power and representation, how much do Asian Americans have in common with various groups? And what we find, and this is found in other surveys as well, is that Asian Americans tend to find more political commonality with whites than they do with Latinos, and they do least so with African Americans. One thing I should note is that top bar that you have shows the proportion of people who think they have a lot in common with the group. And only about 10%, that's the maximum, who think that Asian Americans have a lot of commonality when it comes to political issues with members of other groups. So that points to some potential challenges in coalition building, moving beyond the community leadership level down to the citizen level, the adult resident level. The next slide shows you that even within Asian Americans, there seem to be challenges in finding political commonality. But we asked respondents, when you think of the term Asian, do you think of the term Asian American as mostly about people having a common race, having a common culture, having common economic interests, and having common political interests? We found that there were much stronger responses of people thinking that Asian Americans share a common race and culture than they do common economic and political interests. What was surprising to us was that among South Asians, where at least in the community, you have some of these debates about whether people share the same racial identification or culture, they tend to score very high on Asian Americans sharing a common race and culture. The next slide shows you from another survey how other groups might view Asian Americans. This is kind of the other part of it. There was a question in terms of how much political competition different groups perceive with respect to Asian Americans, and it almost seems like a validation of what we found in our own survey, where African Americans perceive the most political competition with Asian Americans, followed by whites and then Latinos. But all is not, it's not a depressing story, and I'll just quickly go through the non-depressing stories very rapidly. There are elements of hope in building and maintaining a civil rights coalition, because when it comes to some of these fundamental issues like discrimination, Asian Americans are very much similar to other groups. So 1/3 of our respondents indicated that they had been discriminated in at least one context, and we asked about different contexts in which people felt discrimination. The question was, have you ever been unfairly denied, et cetera, et cetera. We find that the highest proportion of people say that they've been unfairly discriminated when it comes to stores and restaurants, but also when it comes to treatment by police and jobs. We also have data on hate crimes, which is the next slide, that shows that close to 10% of Asian Americans report that they've been a victim of hate crimes. It's lowest among Korean Americans, which we can talk about in the Q&A, but it's high among Indian Americans, Japanese Americans, and Chinese Americans. We also find elements of political commonality when you look at the proportion of Asian Americans that have voted Democrat. There's been a very strong shift from the early 90s to this most recent election, where Asian Americans are starting to vote like Latinos and approaching the voting rates of African Americans. So just to conclude, there are many issues today where Asian Americans either should be part of the debate or are part of the debate. In terms of the healthcare debate, we all saw how immigration became a toxic issue, where because of one person yelling during the president's remarks, you drew attention to a provision that has been killed, which is offering health care for particular classes of immigrants. Immigration reform is an issue that will probably come up again. Housing and unemployment are issues that strongly affect the Asian American community. We have a report from UCR which shows that in Southern California, Asian Americans find it very challenging, similar to Latinos and blacks in terms of the foreclosure crisis, much more so than whites. And then finally, public higher education in California. I know my time is up. I have to make this plug. This is a huge issue that in California, but in other places as well. You have the UC system, which serves a very large proportion of Asian Americans, and the kinds of fee increases and cuts in access that they're talking about are going to hurt low to middle income Asian American communities. This is not being framed as a civil rights issue right now, but it should be framed as a civil rights issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Karthik. Now let's welcome Claire.
Thank you. Okay, good morning, everyone. I'd like to start by saying thank you to Stuart and the other organizers of this event. I'm really excited and honored to be here and to be part of it. The title of my presentation today is Asian Pacific Islanders and Intergroup Relations, Challenges and Opportunities. And do I have a mouse up here to forward it, or?
You have to ask them to forward.
Oh, okay. So what I'd like to do is briefly explore 4 questions today. First, which key historical factors have shaped how U.S. minority groups relate to each other today? Second, when and why have conflicts and tensions arisen between Asian Pacific Islanders on the one hand and blacks and Latinos on the other? Third, how and when have Asian Pacific Islanders been able to overcome these obstacles, improve intergroup relations, and build successful coalitions with other groups? And finally, what are some of the particular challenges and opportunities in intergroup relations that attach to this historical moment? Okay, so this, for all of you, is probably a trip down memory lane to your first Intro to Asian American Studies class, but very briefly, key historical factors. So the first historical factor key to understanding intergroup relations today, I think, is the fact that APIs, first the Chinese and then other groups, were constructed from the mid-1800s on as immutable foreigners. That is, as people whose racial cultural difference from white Americans was so pronounced and fixed that they could never live among them as equals. As Charles McLean and other historians have shown, the 1870 Naturalization Act, restricting the right of naturalization to whites and blacks, and numerous court findings around this time period, together rendered APIs, quote-unquote, aliens ineligible to citizenship, a unique and fateful historical status. As unassimilable elements, APIs were a permanently suspect class, prone to being seen as threatening and even treasonous, which is, of course, what happened in the Chinese exclusion movement and Japanese American internment. At the same time that APIs were being marked as unassimilable, they were being located firmly between whites and blacks in transatlantic scientific discourses. Stephen Jay Gould, for one, points out that leading ethnologists in Europe and the US, that is, scientists who studied human racial difference, reached a remarkable degree of consensus during the 1800s that Mongolians or Asiatics fell squarely in between Europeans and Africans in terms of intellectual prowess, physical strength, cultural worth, moral capacity, and fitness for self-government. Together, these two factors, the construction of APIs as immutable foreigners and their placement between whites and blacks in a racial hierarchy, shaped a distinctive racial position for APIs in American society, one which I think continues, in which they are seen as often standing outside of the moral community and body politic, and yet at the same time as being superior to some of the more lowly groups, namely blacks and Latinos. Thus, Chinese laborers were shipped into the Mississippi Delta in the 1870s to replace black workers who were putatively less intelligent and diligent than the Chinese. And the Chinese, though perceived as an economic threat to white labor, were never seen as uncivilized and primitive as Mexican laborers were, because Chinese culture was given its props during this period, even though it was seen as having degenerated from its former greatness. The origins of the contemporary model minority myth go all the way back, I would argue, to this period of the mid to late 1800s. Okay. So in this figure from my own work, I try to capture this distinctive racial position where APIs are seen in the white imagination as outsiders along the scale of insider to foreigner, and yet at the same time as more worthy than blacks along the scale of inferior to superior. If you were to locate Latinos in this figure, I think you could argue they too have an ambiguous racial position, that they are sometimes placed here with APIs, sometimes with blacks, depending on the specifics of the situation. So with that nod to historical factors, let me move on to say something about intergroup relations today. Scholars have focused on two types of factors that contribute to the generation of intergroup tension or conflict. The first set of factors have to do with inequalities or disparities in economic status and position, often coupled with occupational or residential proximity. Some API groups have reached a certain level of economic success and interact, particularly in their workplace, with blacks and or Latinos who are in some sense in a subordinated position, whether it's economically or socially, and this often sets the stage for the emergence of intergroup conflict. Secondly, the cultural stories that get told by the media and other opinion makers about the relative worth of groups. That is, the urban underclass story about blacks and Latinos, the model minority myth about APIs, and its latest instantiation in the theory advanced by social scientists like Herbert Gans, George Yancey, Jennifer Lee, that APIs are the new whites. All of these cultural stories work to generate suspicion and distance among groups, and I think you can actually demonstrate the effects of some of this suspicion and distrust when you're talking about why it's difficult for API organizations in some instances to form coalitions with Black and Latino organizations. So what are some examples of intergroup conflicts involving APIs on the one hand and Blacks and Latinos on the other? Asian Black conflicts have received the most attention. I just selected a few to talk about here, to mention to you here. The Los Angeles Uprising, or Saigu, of 1992, Korean Black conflicts in New York City in the 80s and 90s, which were the focus of my book. The Brian Ho controversy having to do with the Lowell High School and affirmative action issues in San Francisco starting in 1994. And of course, most recently, the whole controversy over does Obama have an Asian problem, right, during the primary, because according to polling, Asian Americans were leaning very heavily toward Hillary Clinton, and they did vote for her in big numbers. Of course, in the general election, Asian Americans came back to Obama and supported him very strongly over McCain. But this was enough during the primaries to give rise to all sorts of media speculation about whether Asians didn't like Obama because he was Black. And so that became a big topic for conversation. But Asian Latino conflicts, which have received less media attention, have also emerged. Just to pick up a few for you, Latino participation, of course, in the LA Uprising. Latinos were among those arrested for criminal activity during the uprising. The largest numbers were Latinos. Korean grocers and Latino employees in New York City, the conflicts that have emerged there. Korean restaurant owners and Latino employees, or hotel owners and Latino employees in LA, an ongoing issue. And then the story of Ten Wen in 2006, the Republican candidate in the 47th Congressional District in California, who was associated, it's still unclear whether fairly or not, with mailings which seemed to try to intimidate Spanish language voters from voting, saying that they could be, if they were immigrants, they could be deported or arrested for voting, with the thought that his opponent, Loretta Sanchez, would probably get most of the Spanish language votes. So that was an interesting controversy which seemed to raise issues about Asian and Latino tensions. So Karthik mentioned this point as well. I wanted to just show a few slides from other recent studies to back him up on this. And what surveys consistently show, and have for some time, is that APIs don't feel very close to other minority groups, and that they don't feel, and that these groups in turn don't feel very close to APIs. APIs tend to feel close to whites, then Latinos, and then Blacks in that order, while Latinos and Blacks tend to feel close to each other and somewhat to whites, but not to APIs. So just to pull a figure from the Committee of 100's report released last spring, just with regard to Chinese Americans, I know this is sort of difficult to read, but the blue lines, the question is on a scale of 1 to 100, with 1 meaning extremely negative, 100 meaning extremely positive, tell me how you feel toward the following groups. The blue lines are white Americans, yellow African Americans, red Hispanic Americans, blue, green Asian Americans, and this is how asked of Chinese American respondents. And the basic idea being here that Chinese Americans tend to view Asians and whites slightly more positively than African Americans and Hispanics. And as you go down lower in the scale toward the more negative ratings, you see larger numbers for responses for African Americans and Hispanic Americans. Also, this from the 2007 Los Angeles County Social Survey, again, asking the question, do you feel any sort of issue-based commonality with other groups? If you look at Asian Americans, they have the least sense of commonality on issues with African Americans, the most with whites. You look at the black numbers, they feel the most commonality with Latinos, and the least with Asians, et cetera. So again, we're seeing the same kind of results over and over again. So while these surveys raise concerns, there is at the same time good reason to be optimistic because API, civil rights organizations, and community groups, as you all know better than anyone, remain committed to intergroup coalitional work, and many of you succeed in doing this kind of work on a regular basis, despite very stringent organizational and financial constraints. So I wanted to just read off a couple of examples for you, just starting with over the last several decades of some of the different kinds of coalitional work that has been accomplished. Starting with, of course, going back to the 60s and 70s, the Red Guards and the Black Panther Party, the United Farm Workers, the fight against Proposition 187, which brought together many Asian and Latino groups, interestingly, sometimes in opposition to black groups, which were somewhat supportive of the measure. Asian Law Caucus has done important work speaking out on behalf of undocumented immigrants, even though Asian immigrants tend to be legal, and taking some flack for that decision. Also, the Asian Law Caucus has done work advocating for and defending black tenants, for instance, in the Double Rock housing controversy in San Francisco in the 90s, even though that was a turned out to be sort of an Asian-black conflict as it worked out. Asian Pacific American Legal Center has done a lot of important interracial coalition work. Just to mention one example, the inclusion of Latina sweatshop workers in the coalition fighting to defend the El Monte workers, enslaved Thai workers, and that decision to broaden the coalition to be cross-racial rather than simply an Asian American effort. The Korean immigrant workers advocates, of course, organizing Korean immigrants as well as Latino workers for better wages, better working conditions, other things related to immigrant labor. Committee Against Anti-Asian Violence in New York City engaged in a lot of important cross-racial coalition work with African Americans, Puerto Ricans, and other communities of color on issues like police brutality, state violence, defending the rights of domestic workers, immigrant welfare mothers, issues like that. Leland Saito and other scholars have written about efforts to fight against English-only activism, right? Some of the nativist movements that have arisen in California and elsewhere, and Asians and Latinos in particularly have come together successfully to fight those kinds of efforts. Redistricting campaigns, of course, often bring Black, Latino, and Asian organizations together, electoral campaigns. And I also wanted to make special mention of Native Hawaiians whose coalitional work has been really exceptional in the sense that they work with Alaskan Natives, American Indians, and indigenous peoples all over the world, really, in sort of a global indigenous network in terms of trying to advance their claims for sovereignty and against U.S. colonialism. So when and why do intergroup coalitions emerge? Just to mention a few studies, Oliver and Grant argue that residential proximity and a relative parity of status and resources among groups encourages coalition work. So they would say Asians and Latinos who tend to be less segregated than blacks, for instance, and maybe have a greater parity of status and resources are more likely to get together than Asians and blacks for that reason. Saito and Park in 2000 write that strong community organizations need to exist within each community, and then those organizations need to have built strong relations across group lines, And those organizations need to be able to resist short-term group-specific thinking in order for things to happen. So following along those two lines, which suggest that both structural factors matter and internal organizational factors matter, I would add a couple other conditions under which coalitions might emerge. One is shared economic interests, Korean immigrant workers advocates being a good example, where you have people who are in low-wage service jobs, which creates a common economic interest and really lays the groundwork for organizing together. Having a shared stake in opposing nativist policies or efforts, and clearly a lot of Asian American Latino cooperation has been built around that dimension. Having an international legal or political framework within which to organize, and I know people are going to talk about human rights as a framework for organizing for Asian Americans, and again, going back to the Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander efforts through international legal and political frameworks to come together. And having an ideology or philosophy of linked fates and solidarity. And I would point to Committee on Asian American Violence, against anti-Asian violence in New York City because of their highly developed sort of anti-patriarchal, anti-white supremacist, anti-capitalist philosophy, which helps them create very deep organic links with other communities of color. So these are some of the conditions, I think, under which API groups can and have successfully overcome obstacles to coalitional work. So, okay. Okay, so now with my last slide, what are some of the challenges and opportunities that attach to this particular historical moment? Well, first, there is the Obama moment, of course. And while most of us would agree that the rumors of the death of racism and the advent of a post-racial society have been greatly exaggerated, there is something to the idea that Obama's electoral victory shakes things up in racial matters. How many of us shook our heads and said, not in our lifetimes, about a black president? So Obama's victory reminds us that ruptures in the fabric of American racial power can and do happen, exceeding all of our hopes, which perhaps opens up space for us to dream bigger and further when thinking about intergroup relations and alliances. There are also particular challenges and opportunities relating to ongoing economic globalization, the climate crisis, and the U.S.'s military involvements in Iraq and Afghanistan. As the third world, led by India and China, pushes back against the U.S.'s environmentalist programs which they read as continuations of Western imperialism, all kinds of interesting possibilities suggest themselves for global activism that is at once anti-racist and concerned with economic justice and environmental integrity as well. And as the U.S.'s involvement in Iraq and Afghanistan continues to raise civil liberties and human rights questions at home and abroad, APIs, I think, are well situated to take up those struggles too, standing shoulder to shoulder with other communities of color. Thank you.
Thank you, Claire. Let's thank Karthik and Claire for their work. I wanted to just share some of the work that we've looked at in the Asian Pacific American Legal Center. And Dan Ichinose and Eugene Lee have headed both our demographic unit and our voting rights unit. And so I'd like to share a few PowerPoints from some of our work. I think Karthik was first talking about the fact that amongst the voting age citizens, Asian Americans have a little less than a 50% turnout rate. What we noticed is that while amongst, for example, registered voters in LA County, there was a 71% turnout during the November 2008 election. That was compared to, say, 78% for the general population, so it was lower. So the point that he made is correct, that we have a lot of work to do. But at the same time, we have to understand the trends in our community, and the trend is going up. So if you look at the year 2000, that was a general election, there were 211,000 Asian American voters in Los Angeles County. By November 2008, that had jumped to 293,000 voters in the November election, a 39% increase. And that was the headline in the LA Times article that just appeared yesterday based on our report. So the trend is very clear that there are more Asian American voters, and the potential to swing and to contribute to the decisions on major elections is definitely there, but it takes a lot of work. Eugene led an effort on nonpartisan voter mobilization, and what we found is that in June of 2008, we got a 17% increase because of our work, and a 6% increase in November, even though most of our partners did not see any increase because there were a lot of voters. So it takes work, but the efforts by a number of groups has increased the Asian American political clout. The second slide, we talked about, Karthik and Claire both talked about sometimes there's an apparent disconnect amongst Asian Americans, even amongst themselves, so that they don't feel a lot of commonality. And sometimes the perception and reality are different. So the perception, either because of ignorance, they don't know, or because they may have individual issues with different communities, there may seem to be a lack of unity. On the other hand, what is the reality? So we looked at, in November 2008, we polled 3,300 people in 36 precincts in Los Angeles County, randomly selected, and about 1,000 of the respondents were Asian American. So in this slide, you see across the board, Asian Americans favored universal health care, which is consistent with Karthik's report too. But if you look at the second one, 74% favored health care for the undocumented. And what was interesting, and depending on which side of the debate on health care you're on, you could say, wow, 54% of Asian Americans would be open to increasing taxes to pay for universal health care. On the other hand, you could say, wow, what a difference between 90% who want universal health care and only 54% who want to pay for it. But anyway, what I do want to point out is that the reality between, the difference between perception sometimes and the reality of unity, you could see in some of the voting, because when it comes down to it, a lot of times Asian Americans may have differences, but when it comes down to the decision, they do find unity in their actual votes. The third slide is again, in 2006, we looked at some of the controversial issues around immigration, and you could see that a significant majority of Asian Americans favored legalization. They did not favor criminalization, and an overwhelming over 80% wanted a reduction in the backlog on the family waiting list. So sometimes when you look at questions asked of Asian Americans, of course this is LA County, but if you say to people, well, do you really want your family members to be waiting for 20 years to rejoin family members in the United States, you get a far different response than if you just say, do you think family visas are important? We've looked at these key political attitudes as ways to help us understand where the Asian Pacific American community, and this is at, and this is on immigration reform. The next slide this is just the ethnic breakdown, and again, every Asian ethnic group, there were differences, but every Asian ethnic group did favor legalization, did not want criminalization, and an overwhelming response amongst all these, the groups that had large respondent numbers on favored a reduction in the backlog of family visas. So I think the key that we see in our work from LA County is that there can be a divide of perception and reality. We have to understand our community where it's at. But the key is if you conduct community education, our community is much more open-minded than sometimes a glimpse may show. I also want to show how Asian Americans voted in the last presidential election. And what you could see here is that Asian Americans on the far left top, 63% of Asian Americans in our pretty large sampling voted for President Obama. But what was particularly interesting in LA County is all of these ethnic groups that are listed here also voted pretty dramatically for President Obama. And you could see some up to over 80%. But Vietnamese Americans who have normally voted Republican in the presidential elections, at least in LA County, did vote for President Obama as well. So again, perception and reality, lack of unity, but it ended up that Asian Americans did unify around a presidential candidate in fairly dramatic numbers, and also joined with Latinos and African Americans, certainly not to the same degree, but did join them in that selection. So again, the key is to understand our community, but to conduct a very in-depth community education to show where is the unity of interest. The last slide I wanted to highlight is in the November 2008 election, we looked at how do Asian Americans vote on, which was a controversial issue in California, the ban on same-sex marriage. And so what we found in November 2008 is 54% of Asian Americans did favor the ban on same-sex marriage, and 46% opposed it. So you could see, well, the Asian American population was pretty much in agreement with the general California vote, which was about 52% for the ban and 48% against it. However, if you want to understand a trend in the Asian American community, we did research and a poll in the year 2000 when the ban, before there was a court decision that reopened the question, the same ban was voted on in 2000. And look at how Asian Americans voted then. 68% voted for the ban and only 32% voted against it. So if you look at the difference between 2000 and 2008, and this was the same kind of polling that we've done, so it's the same kind of sampling, same kind of communities, there's a tremendous swing. So a 14% decrease in those who voted for the ban. And so what I think we look to is understanding these trends is very important because there was a lot of work done by API Equality, our legal center, many different groups between 2000 and 2008 on the issue of marriage equality, and you could see minds changed. So I would just like to also point out that this kind of change doesn't just occur within the general community, but it also can occur within organizations and amongst organizations. So for example, in 2006, there were only about 6 or 7 Asian American groups organized around immigration reform. We worked with the Korean Resource Center, the South Asian Network, and our legal center. We created a coalition of over 50 API organizations dedicated to immigration reform. Then on Prop 6, on the 2007, we organized a brief against the ban on marriage equality, and 63 Asian American organizations signed on to opposing the ban. And I moderated a panel with the one of the justices of the Supreme Court a couple months ago, and he said that he used that brief in his lone dissent to support the rights of same-sex marriage couples to marry. And also in October of this year, Karen Wong, our Vice President of Programs, and others organized over 80 organizations to sign on to a brief to support the right of undocumented students in California to receive in-state tuition. So my point is that, yes, we have to know very clearly and deeply where our Asian American community and Pacific Islander communities are at, but at the same time, the idea is to utilize that knowledge to make changes, to organize, to mobilize. And you could see from some of this data, minds and attitudes do change. Now, you do have these cards before you. If you could, I know we started collecting them, but if you could finish collecting them, we have about 10 minutes to do some of the questions and answers. We have a few cards. Oh. Okay, let me just start off. I know some of the cards are being collected. With great numbers of bi and multiracial populations with Asian heritage emerging, how should we include this demographic group into the analysis of API civic engagement? And what are the implications of this demographic trend?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's challenging to do these kinds of surveys. If you're doing exit polls, even in exit polls, if it's just relying on how people look, that can be challenging as well. But trying to do telephone surveys is extremely challenging because you have a population that's large in numbers, but most polling organizations can't justify dialing 95 people in order to reach the 5 or 6 Asian Americans that they yield. So what we do is we use listed samples, and that's the biggest challenge in surveys like that, is you need to have at least an distinctively Asian first name, middle name, or last name. And you have many Asian Americans now that self-identify as Asian American but don't have any of those. And it becomes a challenge to try to figure out what the size of that population is. We just don't know. So if people have solutions to that, I think that would be great. But that's one of the biggest challenges that we face, especially with the second generation.
Okay. How do you think the economic recession will impact intergroup relations, especially in hard-hit areas like Michigan and other areas? And also, is there data on Asian American relations with Arab Americans and Native Americans?
There's much less written on Asian Americans' relations with Native Americans or Arab Americans. One of the reasons I mentioned the war in Afghanistan and in Iraq is that some of the post 9/11 issues around civil liberties at home have been taken up by some Asian American activists. So the Japanese American Citizens League has spoken out post 9/11 about the targeting, racial profiling of Muslims and Arabs in the U.S. So, and in part because they believe that Japanese Americans, having been targeted during World War II for internment, have a sort of a special standing and a special understanding of what is going on historically. So I think what we see are some emerging coalitions actually between Asian American and Arab American efforts, but in terms of scholarship, I don't think that has quite caught up. There is some scholarship on Pacific Islander relations with or coalitional work with Native Americans, as I mentioned, with Alaska Natives and also indigenous peoples here, Canada, and around the world. So, for example, there's been a little bit written on the People's International Tribunal, which was convened in 1993 in Hawaii by Native Hawaiian sovereignty activists, which was endorsed by American Indian groups, Native American groups, as well as some UN-related groups having to do with indigenous rights and something like 60 other domestic and international indigenous rights groups. So there's been a little bit written on that, so, but not an extensive amount. Probably the most that has been written is on Asian and Black conflict. That's probably gotten the most media and scholarly attention. In terms of the economic recession, I mean, sort of the conventional wisdom is whenever things get tougher economically, you're going to see more hate crimes, for instance, the Vincent Chin killing, happening at a time when the Detroit auto industry was going downhill. So, but I think even though economic recession leads to tensions, that really it has to be a whole sort of set convergence of factors that leads to overt conflict. And so, for instance, in LA in the uprising in 1992, it was, the Latasha Harlins case and a number of other similar events like that that paved the way for the Rodney King case to be reacted to the way it was. And it was a whole combination of different kinds of factors. And when you talk about coalition or conflict occurring between groups, a lot of times what needs to happen, in addition to sort of a background setting of either economic recession or improvement, is activists getting together and saying, we either want to organize conflict or we want to organize some kind of coalitional work. So the conflict I looked at in my book in New York City between Korean grocers and black nationalist activists was not a spontaneous kind of thing like it was in LA. This was an instance where black nationalist and Haitian activists decided this was in their political interest, this is part of their political program to organize against these Korean grocers. So it actually required a high degree of internal organization and purposive activity for group conflict to emerge in that instance.
Let me just, we have just a few more, about 5 more minutes, so let me just try to combine some of these questions. For those Asian ethnic groups that are in favor of legalization, for example, Korean Americans, is that due to the undocumented population amongst Korean Americans? And this is linked to a larger question of what are the ways to identify paths to unite with Latinos on immigration reform?
That's a great question. I do some other research using things like survey experiments to see how framing of issues might affect support on policies. And on the immigration issue, it has a huge impact. So I was curious to see the question in the LA County survey, in which those numbers of people supporting legalization and opposing criminalization should be mirror images, but in fact it's not. So Asian Americans are much more reluctant to say, I want to criminalize people. They might also be thinking about legalization in terms of people becoming citizens that are already eligible, which might resonate with their own interests. So I think there are ways that you can frame these issues to talk about reuniting families, to talk about clearing the backlog, making it easier and quicker for people to become citizens, that I think could get people on board. Another thing we've found is, more generally, when you talk about things like amnesty, generally people are reluctant on that, but if you use other types of language, it does move the needle in terms of support.
Well, we encourage people to ask questions of Claire and Karthik, but as we have a number of workshops coming up, we want to allow you to have a short break. Once again, let's thank Karthik and Claire for their work.